Welcome. Welcome to everybody in the cyberspace audience. And technology has created a new phenomenon, which is you could sit and speak to an empty room or to nobody and reach millions of people. How do you like that? It's like social media. They say the people that created social media are the most antisocial people. They've created a whole environment where you can have many friends and never meet them. Anyway. So the title of of tonight's class is How to Land After You Fly. And it's also in honor of the loving memory of Lydia Leah Garba's Bas Dvora. The yahrzeit is this Thursday, the 28th of Nisan. And the reason I chose this topic, right here, Thursday, 28th Nisan. Yeah, Thursday night probably, whatever. I'm reading what I was told to read. I don't like to tell people when their yahrzeit is. They tell me, So, a very central theme in life is this: the question of balance and finding harmony in your life. There's a cardiologist that would often come to this class, and he once he had a very difficult life. He was going through a hard divorce and a messed up life. And I remember him telling me once, he wishes he could have just one day of total peace. No anxiety, no tension at all. Being a cardiologist, I said to him, so what do you mean, like a straight line? He said, no, not that. Because we all know a straight line is a sign of death. And if you look at a cardiogram, the thing that jumps out at you immediately, that looks like a wave. A healthy heart looks like a wave, where there's valleys and peaks, and they're perfectly aligned. And if you would use that as a type of like a gauge, if you say that's like a way of measuring one's life, you could also say psychologically, what do our lives look like that? A healthy life would look like a healthy pulse, a healthy heartbeat, or a healthy breathing, which is a very balanced exhale, inhale, contraction, expansion, and everything is commensurate to each other. What we call the amount of tension and resolution are proportionate to each other. When you say life goes out of whack, meaning a life that is challenged, it usually comes down to that either the peaks are too high, people's extremes are too high, in other words, there's too much tension, or there's too much resolution. The valleys are too deep, which would be the equivalent of, in other words, a healthy measure of angst is a very important component in life, because what it creates is an element of restlessness, which is healthy for the spirit. Just like a heartbeat, there needs to be an element of movement and mobility and growth. Requires a certain measure of angst, something that you're yearning for, something you're looking for that you haven't reached. And then there's a measure of resolution where you find some peace and resolution. But if there's an extreme of too much angst, which turns, of course, into anxiety, and too much anxiety can turn into depression, and that can go even further, God forbid. Or the other way extreme, too much resolution, what sometimes is called animal bliss, where a person is so content and calm that they're absolutely not motivated. You have no reason to wake up in the morning, no reason to be driven or determined or ambitious to achieve anything. So that's the other extreme. So just like the cardiogram, psychologically, what we want to have is that type of balance. But you'll find in life, people are different, we are wired different. Some of us are very creative, free spirits. We call them bohemians. The others are extremely more grounded and concrete. Some people are very predictable and very reliable, scheduled, like clockwork. Others are completely spontaneous and free-spirited and unreliable, and especially when it comes to, let's say, relationships. Who would you rather have a relationship with? Because on one hand, the first person is reliable, you can rely on them. On the other hand, it can get very monotonous, because like a clerk, it's almost like everything is always predictable. And you want some spontaneity, some spark, some spunk in a relationship in life. On the other hand, the so-called spontaneous one is very exciting, but can you really live with someone like that? Because then there's no reliability, there's no consistency. A word is not a word. Every night is another story. So obviously, everybody would answer, I'd love to have the best of both worlds. Can you have the best of both worlds? And we will discuss, and that's part of the discussion. So in general, especially in Jewish mysticism, it was called Kabbalah, there's a lot of talk about this because it all comes down to the dynamics of the spirit, of the human spirit. In other words, a human spirit unfettered by material needs. We did not need to eat or sleep or pay our bills or find shelter, and in some way have to deal with the realities of a material world. One could argue that the spirit is really is a free, unbound force that has no limits. And it's only because we live in a world of structure that imposes upon us limits. It's one way of looking at things. Or is there something more to it? Now you have different schools of thought. For example, if you compare Eastern mysticism, like Buddhism, Hinduism, and other schools of thought, with all their variations, there's one way to look at the search for the spirit. If you look at Western, for example, philosophies and Western spirituality, it's very different. Western philosophy, sometimes they're compared to Eastern thought as being more like a circle, and Western thought more like a square. Western philosophy, Western spirituality was always very structured, almost mathematical. Whereas Eastern is very circular in the sense it's much more abstract. Like the famous classic Zen koans, for example, the question, what is the sound of one hand clapping? Meant to take us out of our normal structures, our conventional institutions and structures, and try to experience something which is less tangible. Even in physics today, we really have both schools of thought. For example, when you talk about Newtonian physics, which is classic physics until the 20th century, was really the ruling physics, it's like called the billiard ball effect, that everything is predictable, everything has its rules, the rules of gravity, the rules of electromagnetism, the other rules of nature, and the scientific structure. So for example, you throw something up a certain speed, it weighs a certain amount, you can predict exactly at what rate it's going to fall. Billiard ball, you strike a ball, it's the same angle, the same ball, the same size, the same measure, it will always have the same cause and effect. And that's how the world was looked at for many years, for many millennia even, especially the last few centuries, that everything is really what's called a deterministic universe. Deterministic in the sense it's a matter of simply understanding the data, and you can then predict what will be the result of that data. There was even a philosopher, a scientist philosopher named Laplace, a French philosopher at the end of the 19th century, who said that the only thing we're missing is information. But you give me all the data on any human being, on any creature, on any phenomenon in the world, and I can predict, science can predict everything it will do till the end of time. Now this created quite an uproar in the church, because basically it was challenging the whole concept of free will. Because if it's basically wiring, and it's just a matter that we don't know information, in other words, I don't know what you're going to do tomorrow because I don't have enough information on you. But if I could figure out, just like a program in a computer, all the DNA and all the details of what we're made of, and it's predictable, it undermines the concept of free will. So there was a big uproar in that time. But then, the church didn't need to excommunicate him, not that he would have cared, but they already tried that with Galileo. So what happened was, in the 20th century, if you're familiar a little with the evolution of physics, first with Einstein, and then more importantly, quantum mechanics, discovered something that was completely considered bizarre till this day. And that is that on the macroscopic level, on a macrocosmic level, the world is very deterministic. Yes, the sun rises exactly at a certain moment. You can know exactly when the sun will rise for the next million years, barring any change in nature. And you can know when the moon will rise, and you can predict many, many things. However, on the microscopic level, meaning the level that's beneath the surface, that's not visible to the naked eye, what's called quantum level, or micro, or what we call subatomic level, there was discovered it's indeterministic, meaning sometimes called states of probability, states of what in Heisenberg called the uncertainty principle, that there is really fundamental state that no matter even as much data as you have, certain things are indeterministic, and until they're not measured, you can't define or determine which direction it will go. And the classic example is the tests and the proof of whether light is a wave or a particle. Is light made of waves, or is it like wave? Because you have observations that indicate that it functions like a wave, and you have observations that indicate like a particle. Now this was repulsive, frankly, to scientists, because it basically undermines seemingly the principle of science, that it's about mathematical equations and it's a matter of you could predict. But as much as it was tested and retested again and again, it finally became confirmed that today it's given fact in any scientific circle, no one denies it. As bizarre as it is, as much as Einstein refused to accept it, and Einstein said he does not accept, the way he put it, God does not play dice with the universe. Niels Bohr, his colleague, said to him, don't tell God what to do. That's how they conversation, that it came down to the fact that there is a dimension in existence that is indeterministic fundamentally, not due to lack of information. So there you have, even on a scientific level, you also have two schools of thought, which today we know are both true, that there's an element of spontaneity and, so to speak, indeterminism, and there's an element of consistency that's very deterministic. So who would you like to marry? A quantum-like person or a Newtonian or a macrocosmic type of physics structure to the existence? And as we shall discuss, is that Judaism, despite the fact that many people are not aware of its inner truths, the mystical teachings of Judaism actually teach that we really have both components in our own psyche, and you really can find a way to reconcile the two. But to maybe drive the point home, let's take a few really contemporary examples of this. And it's always good whenever you talk about topics like this is to look at it in the context of extremes. Even though it's not always an extreme situation, but you look at extremes. It's a very interesting and sad, tragic phenomenon that in the last 50 years, especially with the rise of what they call the 60s, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, you see some of the greatest geniuses, especially in the musical world, died in young age due to overdoses and so on. I mean, now they're investigating whether Prince's death is connected to that, but most likely. You have Michael Jackson just a few years ago. You have, the list goes on as you go back, and the last, as I said, people in their prime of their career rise simply overdosed. You of course have the classic ones in the time, the late 60s, almost uncanny, and the fact that at the age like 26 or 28, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, you know, some of the greatest musical geniuses of our time, that all OD'd. And you wonder, in their 20s, they didn't even reach the peak of their careers. So when it's analyzed, everybody comes back to the same conclusion. These are people with very free spirits, and they simply kept on, so to speak, pushing the boundaries until the point that they could not contain it. And when you look at the interviews with them and you look at how their lives evolved, they came to a point after their shows and after their musical highs, which was of course very much generated by the drug culture, they simply could not come back to living a life of routines on a structured level. And at some point you just, it's like with the classic example they today have evidence of monkeys. You put them in a cage and you start feeding them cocaine. At some point the monkeys press a button and they get a dose. They will keep pressing the button until they die. Because what happens is once you get addicted to these highs, it's very, very hard to contain it. Which of course brings up the whole big question of what I said before. Once you fly, can you land? I mean, in this country, LSD was legal till 1966. And LSD, as you probably know, was a drug that was developed by Albert Hofmann in the 40s, late 40s. He was looking actually for some type of synthetic chemical that can induce madness. That was his intention. He was looking for something that would be able to simulate an element of madness, so psychiatrists and psychologists could perhaps get into the minds of what was called madness then. Today they don't call it madness, today it's called mental illness, chemical imbalances, a lot of other names for it. And that's what he was looking for. So if you read the story of Hoffman, he just died I think 2 years ago. So he was experimenting, he worked in Sandoz as one of the pharmaceutical labs in Switzerland. And because he couldn't experiment on anyone but himself, so he kept injecting himself or ingesting different types of chemicals, and he knew that he was putting himself at risk. So what he did was he had notepads all over his lab and his home, and recorders, So in case anything should happen to him, he would try to record and write notes. So even if he couldn't come back to tell about it, or God forbid worse, there would be some documentation. This you could check out. This is not some fantasy. This is anyway. He began. I'm telling the story for a reason. You'll see in a moment. So Dr. Hoffman, he began to experimentation. Anyway, he writes in his journals that what happened was one late morning, he took some type of compound that he had concocted, and he was going home for lunch. So he was riding on a bicycle, and he was riding through not a field, a type of a path that had hedges, very tall hedges on both sides. And he was riding. As he's riding, he started feeling strange sensations. And this would be the first. This would be the first chemical psychedelic experience in history. I mean, there were plenty of psychedelic experiences through mushrooms and other things, but those were more natural. And this was synthetic in the sense it was a compound, a chemical. And he started feeling sensations, like strange sensations. And he writes that suddenly he sensed that the hedges began to vibrate, and the colors of the sky began to change color. He started hearing all kinds of sounds, and suddenly he felt like his bicycle had taken off, like a plane, and he was going into a whole different place. And he literally thought he was going mad, because he never experienced anything like this. And as he came home, he kept riding the bicycle, unaware that he was actually going home, because at this point his mind was in a different place, an altered state of consciousness, as one would say. He came home and immediately turned on the tape recorders and the notes, because he knew that he had prepared them, because he didn't know where he was going. And he then passed out at some point. And from his point of view, he may never have, maybe would die, not survive. But he did come to, and obviously once this trip was over, trip literally and figuratively, he realized he had done some type of experience. And the way he describes it, there was a book published a number of years ago. It was called, I think, Storming Heavens, America's Romance with LSD. And what he came to discover was, as I said, the first psychedelic experience, and indeed did help him understand a theory that he developed, which was then further developed by others, how the mind works. Because what his experience was, and this was completely in a medical and scientific point of view. It was not yet a recreational thing. It was completely trying to understand how the mind works, and this drug helped him understand the following. I don't remember exactly all these analogies. I think some of them are my own, because I already internalized it. But the gist of it goes like this: that contrary to popular, to conventional thinking, we think consciousness is a state of revelation. When you're unconscious, for example, God forbid, you're in a coma, or you're knocked out, or you're not aware. So that seems to be a blind state. And consciousness is that I'm aware. I'm aware that you're sitting in the room here. I'm aware of the objects in this room. I could analyze it. I can study it. I can communicate with it. That's usually the understanding of consciousness as opposed to unconsciousness. So when we're asleep, for example, or we're under anesthesia or under some other type of trance or spell, it would seem to be a limited form of consciousness. He actually came to the idea that the exact opposite is true. That consciousness is a very limited flow coming from a collective unconscious state. To take an example, again, I think this is my own example, I don't remember, because as I said, I read it years ago and then I began to explain it and write about it. Take, for example, a reservoir of water, okay? A reservoir where we get our tap water at home. The water you shower, the water you bathe in, the water you drink. The water that comes into your faucet, into your home, is coming from, of course, pipes, which in turn come from a main artery, main water mains, which in turn come from rivers that are driven from the reservoirs that are collecting rainwater and other water, the melted snow and so on. That is really our source of all our water needs. Okay. Now the faucet is critical. Why? Because it gauges and it regulates the flow. If our faucet breaks, you have a flood, right? So the faucet, the way you could say, is really the gauge, the chemicals in the mind that allow only a stream of limited consciousness to emerge in your mind, so you don't get overwhelmed. When you look at people, what was called madness then, or chemical imbalances today, what really is going on when a person has, let's say, severe paranoia? or clinical fear, or other forms, even bipolar or schizophrenia or other types of imbalances, what's happening is that there's an unregulated flow. When a person is, let's say, only seeing negative everything, and everything they see negative, they get into a state of depression. And you say to them, not everything is negative. There's positive things in life and negative things in life. And they say, I only see the negative. What's happening? There's a flow that is the chambers, so to speak, the closets, the compartmentalization that a mind needs to be able to survive is missing. So, for example, when we have, God forbid, a loss or trauma, and we all will go under experience at some point in our life some loss. I lost my father 11 years ago, passed away. It was a very shocking trauma. Death is a traumatic experience, no matter how old your parent may be. And if after a while, so initially there's a shock, it's overwhelming, but after time passes, we don't forget the death, we don't forget our parents, we don't forget the loss, but it doesn't have quite the emotional impact in a year later, or 2 years later, or 5 years later as it had initially. Why? Because the mind intelligently knows how to compartmentalize and say, okay, this is an event that happened. At some point, you have to learn to cope with it. You have to learn to grow through it. You have to Now, people who cannot grow through something, either through post-traumatic syndrome or something is so overwhelming that they can't grow through it, they can't get away from it, what's happening? There's a chemical missing, or there's something that's not allowing this to be put in the closet. Now, every year, my father's yahrzeit, obviously, I re-evoke, and I can right now re-evoke the feelings I had 11 years ago. But my mind has the capacity to say, here's what happened, and there's other things that have happened. So you have difficult things in life, you have blessings in life. Once those boundaries break down, which really means chemicals that break down, what's happening is the flow is so overwhelming that you just can't manage. So in a certain way, you can say sanity and consciousness is really based on blindness, not on awareness. It's based on limited awareness as opposed to full awareness. Because if we were fully cognizant of everything all the time, we would be bombarded with so many ideas and so on. So when you have ideas come into your mind, a creative person, you have ideas. Some people think, where do ideas come from? I once asked somebody, where do ideas come from? They think it comes from the shower head. Why? Because in the shower we get most of our ideas. But obviously it doesn't come from the shower head. It comes from a part of our so-called unconscious that has, you can say, a multitude of infinite possible ideas. And ideas flow in like a faucet, drop by drop. When you think of an idea, you always see the image in cartoons, or the imagery for a conception of an idea is always a flashbulb, or a lightning bolt. Why? Because it's like a bolt. It's like, where did it come from? You say, where did that come from? It's like a spark. And when you think about it, a spark means sparks come from a flame. They don't come from nowhere. But we have no access to that flame consciously. So think of the flame as just an example like the reservoir, as a large body of many, many ideas. And the faucet of our minds allows only a certain amount of ideas to flow. But what happens if that faucet breaks? What would happen if the regulator breaks? The flow would be too overwhelming. And that's why you'll find many, many times the expression, there's a very thin line between genius and madness. You'll find some of the greatest geniuses are literally on the edge of madness. Now, what the difference would be is if it goes over to madness, then they're not in control. And when it's not madness, they are more or less in control. But they're still always tottering at that boundary. There was a great dancer, I forgot his name. I think he was a Russian dancer. And it was like brilliant, beyond, one of the, I forgot the name. You can look it up. And then at some point in his 30s, he went mad. Literally, they had to put him in an insane asylum. And the only way you can get him back, so to speak, to some moment of sanity was when someone would dance with him. Because that would bring back his that focus. So I think there's a picture actually where someone goes into his room where he had to be in solitude because he could kill himself. He was completely self-destructive. And when you would talk to him, what happened was he says, I can't stop the flow. It's like overwhelming me. It's like a flood. And then someone would start dancing, and you see he suddenly would go into this acrobatic dance mode, and for a moment this genius that everyone knew came back. But it didn't last, obviously. The point I'm making here is, and I go back now to the Hendrixes and the Joplins and even people who survived, Miles Davis and others, but they survived. Elvis Presley. Because there's some point where you get such state of high that if you don't have a way to ground it, it simply becomes overwhelming, and at some point it will kill a person. Drugs is unfortunately a way that gets you a superficial high that takes you to places, but you can't come back in a normal way. I've talked to many, many people because I find that the fascinating parallels between the way the Jewish mystics explain this idea with science's explanation, and of course with all these geniuses. So I talked to a lot of people who were very heavy into psychedelics and LSD, and they all say the same thing, that most of our friends destroyed their lives. Those of us that survived were never the same, because you go back to your routines and it's too boring. And you're desperate to go back to have that high. It's like someone that's so touched by music, they can't live in a world without music. So that sounds beautiful. But what happens when it becomes so powerful that you can't ground yourself again? So you literally have, Jimi Hendrix has a lyric in one of his songs, I think it's Purple Haze, actually, which is directly about LSD, Purple Haze. And he says there, at the end of one of the beginning lyrics, he says there, I forgot the entire line, but I remember the last line. He says, "Excuse me until I kiss the sky." So he kissed the sky. But what happens when you kiss the sky and you can't come back to earth? And that's what happened. I don't know if you've heard of a Russian Jewish artist, Rothko. So he became one of the most famous artists. His painting, these are the very huge paintings that have. Earlier on he was a regular artist, then later it became more and more abstract. It's usually like squares of different colors. And his paintings go for millions and millions of dollars. In his heyday, he wasn't depressed, he had no loss, he was the most popular artist possible. And yet, what happened is, in the 70s, in 1970 I think it was, or 1969, he commits suicide. Completely inexplicable. Why would a man, at the height of his career, popularity, everything was working well in his life, he commits suicide? And when you study his paintings, you see, as he moves, the colors, as he moves from the 50s to the 60s to the late 60s, he gets darker and darker and darker. Like the colors in the late, he began as a regular artist, and then he began to what they call deconstruction. Him, Kandinsky, and others that were more like abstract artists that began to deconstruct so-called the structures of existence to get to the core, what make everything tick. So he got it down to these colors, and initially they were brighter colors. They were like pink, yellow, light green, and so on. As you move along, you see they get darker and darker and darker. His colors in the late 60s, like the last paintings he ever did, are dark brown, dark gray, dark black, those colors. And I was trying to understand, I wish I would have met him. I never met him, but I was reading, like, what would drive a person like that? And I was thinking if it has anything to do with his Jewishness. Not that Jews are the only ones that commit suicide, God forbid, but I was just looking, is he more angst and so on, more neurotic than others? And then I discovered something very fascinating. He began studying Jewish Kabbalah in his some point, I'm not sure when. He began studying it and he began writing about it. And he discovered a theme that I talk about a lot in this class, the doctrine of the tzimtzum. I'll explain in a moment what that is. It's a Hebrew word. This is from the great mystic and Kabbalist Rabbi Isaac Luria from the Tzfat Kabbalists in northern Israel in the 16th century. He's considered the greatest Kabbalist probably in history, sometimes called the Holy Ari, Arizal, Isaac Luria, Lurianic, Kabbalah, there's different names for it. And one of his main contributions was what he called the secret or the doctrine of the tzimtzum. Now the word for tzimtzum literally means contraction or concealment or, those are the best translations for the word tzimtzum. Now here's the interesting thing. Why was this doctrine so important? Because the Arizal was dealing with the dilemma that every philosopher and thinker deals with, and that is, how do we reconcile a deeper, higher sense of God and godliness and a higher reality with a world that is so separate and so easily consumed with its own selfishness and narcissism? Like he and many other mystics always knew that there's some integral connection between everything in existence. What physicists call today a type of either string theory, or there's something that connects everything. Today it's a pretty common knowledge that nature and the universe in which we live is not a bunch of different fragmented parts. It's part of one mosaic, like one symphony. The only ones that disturb the symphony is the human being. But if you took the human being out of the equation, look at nature. It's unbelievable design, symmetry, harmony, nature, the symbiotic relationship with different species, the relationships, the give and take. Even prey and predator have a certain type of poetic dance going on. Obviously, no one likes prey being killed. But at the end of the day, if you look and study it, the creatures that are consumed by other creatures are the ones that multiply in the largest numbers. There are far more vegetable, for example, more vegetables in this world than there are animals. There are far more insects than there are larger animals. And in direct proportion to the amount of how much prey are consumed is how much they multiply. So, for example, if there was no predator, the creatures or the vegetables that they would consume begin to multiply and they begin to destroy the universe. So there's a real balance. Even things that we call natural disasters, like hurricanes, typhoons, tsunamis, cyclones, you name it, earthquakes. If human beings were not in the way, these are very much part of the balance of existence. Earthquakes are necessary to relieve the tensions between the plates. There are earthquakes that take place every few seconds under the sea. They don't affect us. On the contrary. Hurricanes as well. They're all part of so-called the immunity system that keeps the world healthy. So nature is a most fascinating example of symmetry. Take our human body. Just your own human body. Study it. A healthy body is amazing. We have 75 trillion cells in the body. Trillion, not billion. It's the only thing that's more than the USA deficit. We have 75 trillion cells. We have thousands, tens of thousands of systems. Just take one piece of food, and what happens to it? You put it in your mouth, and think of how many processes have to work, and all in symmetrical order, for that food to ultimately become part of our blood, to eliminate the waste, and so on. I mean, it's just unbelievable when you start thinking that the air pipe, the windpipe closes and contracts when the food pipe opens. I mean, God forbid, again, I'm talking about in healthy circumstances. How the breathing works, how the heart works, the pulmonary systems, and so on and so forth. So what you have is a very powerful balance. And therefore, in such a world, the question that all philosophers, mystics, thinkers, poets, romantics, all ask the question, so why is there imbalance in the world? Why are we humans the only ones that can screw it up? We can go and mess up the balance in nature, mess up the balance in our own lives. You know, you see a newborn, thank God, a newborn child is born healthy. Look how they breathe. Their chest heaves up and down perfectly. They're using 100% of their lungs. What about as adults? Try to take a very deep breath in, and you'll find yourself coughing usually. Because we don't use 100% of our lung. Because once toxins enter, the lung begins to weaken, and so on. So the question that's asked is, how is it possible that human beings can be so unjust to each other? And the root of war and evil and selfishness and greed, when everything else in existence is the exact opposite. All works in a very balanced way. So the Arizal, this is one of the dilemmas he came to resolve. He said, because there's a thing called a tzimtzum, that the God himself concealed his presence. Basically, this integral, innate unity that connects everything is concealed from us. In truth, we are all part of one large organism, but we don't feel it. So just like one arm would never hurt another arm, one human being would never hurt another human being if we really were aware of that connection. But since we're not, we think we're separate. We think I'm me, you're you. So we can become selfish, we become narcissistic, and we can become destructive. In the name of what I want, I will take something from you. You'll take it from me. Now, this doesn't mean we're forced to be that way. It means we're capable of being that way. So we can be noble, but we could also be very selfish. And so the tzimtzum, in his way of putting it, is essentially concealing the integral unity of all of existence. This was what Rothko was studying, especially in the late 60s. And this is my submission, my theory. It's a pure theory. I have no real evidence because I didn't know him. I don't have empirical evidence. But I think that as he was deconstructing existence as a brilliant artist would do, he hit the ceiling. He hit the tzimtzum, and he couldn't go further. So once you come to a point like that, and he lived it wasn't just theory for him, It was like there was nothing more to live for. He, in a sense, deconstructed it all. It's like took it all apart, and what did he hit? A black hole. Now, had he studied a little mysticism, Jewish mysticism, further, he would have realized there was something else. There was, after the black hole, there's a whole other dimension of light. But I don't think he hit that part. So he suffered what so many other geniuses suffered. Flew, higher, and higher, and could not find a way to ground themselves and bring it back down to earth. And this is a fundamental theme in Jewish mystical thought, and even in biblical thought. And the reason I decided to speak about it now is because firstly we're coming after Passover, and we're also reading in the Torah chapters of the week. The Torah breaks into 52 chapters, corresponding to 52 weeks of the year. And the theme of this week's chapter is exactly this. There were two sons of Aaron, the high priest. Their names was Nadav and Avihu. And in their great search for spiritual high, ecstasy, to have a euphoric, divine spiritual experience, they rushed into the Holy of Holies in the temple. But they went in unprepared. And the Torah tells us the following, these are exact words. They went into the Holy of Holies with very good intentions. They were not bad people, they were not selfish people. They were looking to have the deepest spiritual experience one can have, and they were hungry for it. But being unprepared, it says, they were consumed by a strange fire. Those are the words. Foreign fire, strange fire. I find that to be fascinating. This is the biblical verse that goes back thousands of years. Strange fire, foreign fire is very much used often when they describe drugs. That's like a strange fire, a foreign fire, and so on. Now, there wasn't drugs in their case. In their case, it was a spiritual experience, but they did not have the containers to contain it, to ground it, and to come back to tell about it. So they actually died. This is the first burnout, you can say, in history, at least documented, and goes back thousands of years. And then in this week's chapter, this chapter begins by saying, and after the death of these two men, after the death of these two great men, God gives Moses and Aaron, the rules of how you enter into the Holy of Holies in a way that you can contain it and experience it in a proper fashion. And the key element is this. You can't go in on your terms. If it's your own selfish wish, even for a good thing, but it's yours, then it will ultimately consume you. You have to have what we call in the Hebrew language which is a new word some of you may never have heard of, called bittul. Bittul is loosely translated as modesty, humility, but I would say something even more. It's really the element of suspending yourself in order to absorb experience greater than yourself. When we talk about awe, when you're in awe of something, you're standing by the Niagara Falls, or something else from the seven wonders of nature, and you stand in awe, what is the definition of awe? Definition of awe is that you sense something greater than yourself. If it's about you, you're not going to have awe. You see something. You see a beautiful sight. You fall in love. You listen to a beautiful piece of music. Anything that's greater than you, and you suddenly dissolve and become absorbed in the experience, that is called a form of you becoming consumed by something greater than you are. But if it's about you and your hunger, then that force that can be so uplifting can end up destroying you. Like fire. If you want the fire too much and you jump in too quickly, you get burned. But if you allow yourself to take your ego, put your ego aside, and just experience it for the truth of the experience instead of it being so much about me, that's the key. This is what God tells Moses and Aaron, how you enter the Holy of Holies. You have to have a true measure of humility. And I would submit that those that have that becomes a form of like almost a buffer that allows you to enter into very deep ecstatic experiences and come back intact and grounded and contain it and integrate it into your life. So there's a Talmudic story that talks about the 4 sages that went into the orchard. That's the way it's described, the orchard. In metaphorical language, the orchard is always a spiritual experience. 4 different individuals, Ben Azai, Ben Zema, Elisha ben Avuya, and Rabbi Akiva. They're their 4 names. And here's what happened to them. They all were great sages. One died, literally died, overwhelmed by the experience. The second one went mad. This is a Talmudic story. The third one became an apostate. He stopped believing, became a heretic. Too confused by the whole thing. And one, Rabbi Akiva, says, entered in peace, and he exited in peace. That's the words used. Shalom in Hebrew is peace, shalom. He went in peace, meaning in a wholesome way, and he came out as a wholesome. Of course, the big question that everybody wants to know, what was his secret? Why were the other three were damaged or wounded? Death, madness, confusion. And he was the only one that went in peace. And the answer lies very much in the history of his life. Rabbi Akiva was an unbelievable sage and a tremendous force, but only matched by his unbelievable humility. So here's the story. Rabbi Akiva, the Talmud tells us, actually grew up ignorant. He was not knowledgeable. He was illiterate. And until age 40, he never really succeeded in anything. Then he met this beautiful woman. The Talmud tells the story. They fell in love with each other. Now she came from a very wealthy and very affluent and very educated family. Now Rabbi Akiva was a brilliant mind, but he never had the opportunity. It's a little shrouded in mystery, why not? Some say his parents died early, some say he was a convert, he came from converts. Bottom line is he did not have the opportunities. But she recognized the tremendous potential he had. He's 40 years old. Now 40 years old is today maybe young, but then it was not so young. The life expectancy wasn't much higher than that. But he's 40 years old. And she was trying to persuade him, and he said, for me it's too late. 40 years old, your mind is hardened, your personality is inflexible. How am I going to change? That's my lot. She saw in him much more potential than that, than he believed in himself, and she kept on telling him no. Every human being, the human spirit does not get hardened. The human spirit always remains malleable, flexible, resilient, and there's no question that if you set your mind to it, you can become you can achieve greatness. So he was pondering this thought. He was walking one day in the woods, and he came by and he saw a little rivulet of water running. And there's always good opportunities in nature. You meditate, you ponder your life, your purpose. And he was watching this little river flow, and then he saw a sight that caught his attention. He saw as the river flowed, there was a little waterfall. The water dropped, and near on the bank of the river, this little river, he saw a stone, and a stone that had a perfectly round hole, like drilled through it. Now, you usually don't see a stone with a hole in it like that, like a perfect hole. He's wondering, how did that stone become that way? And he's watching closely. He sees that the water, as it would spray from the waterfall, kept on spraying into that stone. So he realized over the years, the water ultimately bore a hole through the stone. So he said to himself, if a hard stone, an inanimate stone, can be pierced by a drop of water over time, and literally a complete perfect hole should be like as if drilled through it, how much more so a human soul that is more than a stone? That no matter what his life was like, things can change. And this lesson confirmed everything that his future wife, told him. And he decided. They married, and her encouragement, went to study. 24 years later, actually my mistake, no, 12 years later, 1 second, I don't remember how many years. Let's put it this way, it's a number of years. He came back with 24,000 students. And then the Talmud says he became the greatest master of Talmudic thought that ever lived. As a matter of fact, the greatest mystic, the number one mystic, the Zohar, if you've heard of the Zohar, the Holy Zohar, which is the classic book of Kabbalistic thought, was written and composed by his student, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, who we will celebrate his yahrzeit in a few weeks on Lag BaOmer. So this Rabbi Akiva, who had literally seemingly no background, no opportunity, from a stone learned this lesson. This is called a great person. Greatness is not how confident he was in himself, how brilliant he was, how powerful he was, which was all true. It was he did not let his self get in the way. So a man like that goes into the orchard, has a spiritual experience, he's going to come out intact. Because it's not about him. Think of it this way. I'll use a little, this comes from Jewish mystical thought, but if you're familiar with other mysticism, this may resonate. The question, when you put a dry hand in water, what happens? It gets wet, right? That's pretty obvious. What about when you put water in water? Does water get wet? Does a fish get wet? So the obvious answer is water doesn't get wet because it's wet already. What does that tell us? What does that teach us? That teaches us there are things we experience and there are things we become. Very, very different. You could learn information and gather data and know more than you know that you knew yesterday. You know more today than you knew yesterday. That still doesn't mean you've become one with the knowledge. It means you know more. You've experienced another experience. You've had another experience under your belt, in your resume. Then there's where you become. It's called a becoming. You become the thing you experience. So that's a whole different story. You become one with it. Sometimes, let's talk about it from a context of love. Is love a verb or a noun? Is love an action? Or is love a state of being? So some people say that for men it's a verb and for women it's a noun. For men it's an action, to love someone, and for a woman love is a state of being. It's a full, all-encompassing state of being. So there's some people who go into water and they get wet, and there's some people who become water and they are wetness itself. Same thing with knowledge, and there's an expression used, we actually read it on the last day of Passover in the Haftarah, a world filled with divine knowledge, listen to the metaphor, as the waters cover the sea. Remember earlier what I spoke about Albert Hoffman, his theory of intelligence and consciousness was that a collective unconscious is like a reservoir full of water, and the conscious wisdom is simply like the very narrow rivers or faucets that allow the water in drop by drop. Should you open up the faucets, we'd be flooded by too much and we'd be destroyed by it. However, there's one way you can enter that unconscious place and not get overwhelmed. And that's when you yourself become water. When you yourself are no longer this dry entity that's trying to experience something. Today there's an expression you hear often people call it being in the zone. You hear it from athletes, you hear it from writers, from poets, from musicians. What does it mean being in the zone? If you've ever experienced it, you'll identify with this. It means there comes a point where you don't even realize that you're experiencing something. Let's say, I'll give you a simple example, would be you're reading a book, and you get so engrossed, immersed in the book story, you don't even realize you're reading a book any longer. You don't even realize you're turning pages. The story you've become part of the story. It's so absorbed you. You become so absorbed in it that you become one with it. And then if you step back and say, 1 second, all this is a book, I'm turning pages. As soon as you become aware of your experience, you're already no longer in the experience. So being in the zone means there's no longer a distinction between object and subject. They dissolve into the other. It's like you're up all night with a project you really love and you're passionate about. And suddenly you look at the watch, you say, it's 5 o'clock in the morning, I'm hungry, I'm tired. Why didn't you realize it till now? Because you were so part of it. There was no to experience, it wasn't you and the experience, you were the experience. This is what happens when a person has true humility and doesn't allow their ego. When someone says, I want something too much, that alone is going to be the undoing of being able to truly gain it. Like someone wants to have, you'll see everything real in life, you can't just go and acquire. This is one of the mistakes of our commercialized society. With acquisitions.